I learned early that some homes are loud with words and quiet with care. Ours was one of those places where voices filled every corner, but understanding never quite arrived. The apartment smelled of burnt coffee most mornings, a bitter scent that clung to the curtains and settled into my clothes, as if even the air had grown tired. I used to wake up before everyone else, not because I was disciplined, but because silence was the only safe hour. In those moments, I felt almost invisible, in a good way. Invisible enough to think, invisible enough to hope. I didn't grow up believing I was special. I grew up believing I was tolerated. There's a difference, and it shapes you quietly, like water shaping stone. I learned to measure my words, to soften my excitement, to swallow my pride before it had the chance to rise. I watched my parents praise other people's children with a warmth they never seemed to find for me. Good grades were expected, not celebrated. Effort was assumed, not acknowledged. Anything beyond survival was considered unnecessary ambition. School became my second home, not because it was kinder, but because it made sense. There were rules, objectives, answers that could be right or wrong. At home, everything felt subjective. My tone, my posture, my dreams. At school, I could disappear into the back row with a notebook full of margins scribbled with thoughts I didn't dare say out loud. I discovered that learning gave me something my home didn't. Forward motion. Each page turned was proof that time could move in a direction other than circles. I didn't announce my dreams because I'd learned what happened when I did. Dreams in my house were treated like impractical hobbies, things you indulged in only if they didn't interfere with reality. And reality, according to my parents, was narrow. It was safe, predictable, and painfully small. They talked about life as something to endure, not explore. Their disappointments hung in the air like unfinished sentences, and I understood early that I was not meant to add to them. So I learned to want things quietly. I read college essays at night with a flashlight, the glow barely piercing the darkness of my room. I imagined campuses I'd never seen, lives that felt almost fictional, not glamorous, just free. Free to choose, to fail, to begin again. The idea that I could belong somewhere without constantly proving my worth felt radical, dangerous even. Emotionally, I lived in a state of constant negotiation, between who I was and who I was expected to be, between my curiosity and their fear. My parents weren't cruel in obvious ways, they were consistent in their doubt. And doubt, repeated often enough, becomes a language. It teaches you to question your instincts, to brace yourself before joy arrives, to wait for the catch. I became skilled at lowering my expectations before anyone else could do it for me. There were moments, small, almost invisible, when the weight of it all pressed harder. Like the time I brought home a test with the highest grade in the class and my mother asked why it wasn't perfect. Or when I mentioned a writing contest and my father said those things never lead anywhere. Their words weren't shouted. They were delivered calmly, as if stating facts. That was the hardest part. There was no drama to rebel against, no explosion to escape, just a steady erosion of confidence. I started to feel like my existence required justification, like I owed the world an explanation for taking up space. I became hyper-aware of my presence, apologizing too often, hesitating before speaking. Emotionally, I lived slightly bent inward, protecting something fragile I didn't yet know how to defend. I didn't have language for it then, but I was grieving a version of myself I hadn't been allowed to become. Still, there was a quiet resilience forming beneath all that restraint. It didn't look like confidence. It looked like persistence. Like staying up late to study not because I was told to, but because it felt like an act of self-respect. Like choosing essays over parties, not out of virtue, but out of hunger. I didn't believe in myself loudly, but I believed enough to keep going. The environment I grew up in taught me to be observant. I learned to read moods the way other people read weather forecasts. I knew when to retreat, when to comply, when to disappear into my room and become smaller. But that same awareness sharpened something else in me: empathy. I noticed how people carry pain differently, how disappointment can harden into control, how fear often disguises itself as authority. Understanding this didn't excuse my parents' behavior, but it complicated it. And complication strangely made survival easier. Emotionally, I lived between longing and loyalty. I loved my parents. That's what made everything harder. Love, when mixed with invalidation, creates a particular kind of confusion. You start to wonder if wanting more is a betrayal, if leaving means abandoning, if success will cost you connection. These questions followed me everywhere, like shadows that grew longer the closer I got to graduation. By the time college entered my thoughts seriously, it wasn't just a goal. It was a symbol of distance, of choice, of a life where I wouldn't have to translate myself constantly. But even thinking about it felt heavy, like lifting something I wasn't sure I was allowed to carry. Emotionally, I was split between anticipation and dread. I wanted the future, but I feared the moment I'd have to name it out loud. So I stayed quiet. I prepared in silence. I built hope the way you build a fire in the wind, carefully, shielding it with your hands, never assuming it would last. The beginning of my story isn't marked by triumph or rebellion. It's marked by restraint. By a girl who learned to survive emotionally before she learned to dream publicly. And that context matters. Because before there was courage, there was caution. Before there was strength, there was endurance. Before I ever believed I could leave, I had to believe, slowly, painfully, that my inner life was worth protecting, that the ache I felt wasn't ingratitude but instinct, that wanting more didn't mean rejecting where I came from. It meant refusing to disappear inside it. This is where my story truly begins, not with a letter, not with a confrontation, but with a quiet understanding that my emotional world deserved expansion, even if no one around me was ready to see it. The conflict with my parents was never a single event. It was an accumulation, a slow, almost methodical layering of moments that taught me over time that love could exist without encouragement, that presence didn't guarantee protection, and that words, especially quiet ones, could leave marks just as deep as shouting ever could. My mother had a way of laughing that felt harmless to anyone listening from the outside. It wasn't cruel in tone. It wasn't sharp. That was what made it dangerous. Her laughter carried disbelief, not humor. When I spoke about ideas that reached beyond the walls of our apartment, college, careers, writing, a different life, it surfaced almost automatically. A small laugh, a raised eyebrow, a look exchanged with my father, as if my dreams were punchlines I hadn't realized I was delivering. My father's wounds came differently. He didn't laugh. He dismissed. He spoke in conclusions. Statements that sounded like facts but were really verdicts. That's not realistic. People like us don't do that. You're setting yourself up to fail. He framed limitation as protection, fear as wisdom. And because he said it calmly, confidently, I learned to doubt my own reactions. I wondered if I was being dramatic, if wanting more really was naive. The hardest part wasn't the individual comments, it was the pattern. Every time I gathered the courage to share something I cared about, the response followed the same shape. Minimization, redirection, warning. I started to anticipate it before it happened. I learned to brace myself emotionally before speaking, the way you tense your body before stepping into cold water. Eventually, I stopped sharing altogether, not because I had nothing to say, but because silence hurt less than disappointment. Humiliation didn't always come in public scenes. Sometimes it was subtle. Sometimes it was wrapped in concern. My mother would compare me to other people's children, not to motivate me, but to remind me of my supposed limitations. My father would question my decisions in ways that made me feel incompetent rather than supported. They didn't trust my judgment, and over time, I began to absorb that mistrust as my own. There were moments that replayed in my mind long after they happened. Like the night I stayed up late finishing an application essay, heart racing with the idea that maybe, just maybe, it mattered. The next morning, exhausted but proud, I mentioned it at breakfast. My mother sighed and said I was wasting time on fantasies. My father asked what my backup plan was when I failed. No one asked why it mattered to me. No one asked how I felt. Those moments chipped away at something essential. They taught me that effort didn't guarantee respect. That vulnerability invited dismissal. That hope, when shared, could be taken apart piece by piece until it felt embarrassing to have ever held it. Emotionally, I learned to armor myself, not with confidence, but with detachment. I pretended not to care about things that mattered deeply, just to avoid giving them something else to dismantle. Rejection in my house didn't look like abandonment. It looked like conditional acceptance. I was valued when I was compliant, quiet, useful. When I stayed within the boundaries they set, there was peace. When I stepped outside them, even slightly, tension filled the room. I learned that love had terms, even if no one ever said that out loud. And living under unspoken terms is exhausting. You're always guessing, always adjusting, always afraid of crossing an invisible line. The emotional wounds deepened because I wanted their approval so badly. I wasn't trying to rebel. I wasn't trying to prove them wrong. I wanted them to be proud. I wanted to see belief in their eyes when they looked at me. Instead, I saw skepticism, concern, sometimes pity. Those expressions followed me everywhere. They echoed in my thoughts when I studied, when I doubted myself, when I hesitated before taking risks. Over time, their voices became internalized. Even when they weren't in the room, I heard them, questioning, warning, predicting failure. I would downplay my achievements before anyone else could. I learned to introduce my goals with disclaimers, as if apologizing for wanting them. Emotionally, I became split, part of me striving forward, part of me pulling back, afraid of being seen as ridiculous. What hurt most was the loneliness of it all. Friends talked about their parents helping with applications, celebrating acceptances, encouraging ambition. I listened and smiled, feeling like I was missing some essential manual everyone else had been given. At home, I navigated everything alone, researching, applying, dreaming in secret. The lack of support didn't just make things harder, it made them lonelier. There were times I questioned whether I was ungrateful. My parents had provided food, shelter, stability. I knew that. I felt guilty for wanting more than survival. That guilt tangled itself around my resentment until I could barely separate them. I loved my parents, and I resented them. I depended on them, and I felt trapped by them. Those contradictions lived inside me constantly, creating an emotional tension that never fully released. Their attempts to limit my dreams were often framed as realism. But realism, when used to shrink someone, becomes a weapon. Each warning felt less like concern and more like a boundary drawn around my potential. Over time, I started to feel smaller inside my own life, like I was living under a ceiling I hadn't agreed to, constantly ducking so I wouldn't hit it. The conflict wasn't just about college, it was about autonomy, about who got to define my future. My parents believed authority came from age and experience. I believed it came from self-knowledge. That difference created a rift that words couldn't bridge. The more I grew internally, the more out of place I felt at home. And that growing distance carried its own pain. A grief for the connection I wished we had but never did. Emotionally, the wounds showed up in quiet ways. In my fear of speaking confidently. In my habit of second-guessing decisions. In the way I struggled to trust praise. Even when others believed in me, part of me waited for the correction, the dismissal, the laugh. I had learned that approval could vanish quickly, and that made me cautious with joy. By the time I reached the end of high school, I wasn't just tired, I was worn down, carrying years of doubt that wasn't originally mine, holding emotional bruises that no one could see. But that shaped every step I took. The conflict with my parents had taught me many things, but none of them were gentle. It taught me endurance before confidence, silence before self-expression, survival before fulfillment. And yet beneath all those wounds, something remained unbroken. A quiet insistence. A belief that their voices, no matter how loud or constant, did not have to be the final ones. The conflict hurt me deeply, but it also clarified something essential, that if I didn't choose myself, no one else would do it for me. That realization didn't heal the wounds immediately, but it marked the beginning of understanding them. And understanding, I would later learn, is the first step toward release. The turning point didn't arrive with drama. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no triumphant declaration of independence. It came quietly, almost respectfully, the way truth sometimes does when it's waited long enough to be heard. It came during a moment so ordinary that I almost missed it. Me alone in my room, late at night, surrounded by papers, deadlines, and the soft hum of a life still undecided. I was rereading an application essay I'd written weeks earlier, not to edit it, not to improve it, but to understand why I'd written it the way I had. Every sentence bent itself inward, every accomplishment softened, every dream wrapped in caution. I sounded like someone asking permission to exist, and that realization hit me harder than any of my parents' words ever had. For the first time, I saw clearly how deeply their voices had rooted themselves inside me, not just as memories, but as habits of thought. I had internalized their doubts so completely that I was now the one minimizing myself, saving them the effort. That awareness hurt, but it also did something else. It gave me back responsibility. If their voices were living inside me, then maybe, just maybe, I could ask them to leave. That night, I didn't feel brave. I felt tired. Tired of negotiating with fear. Tired of carrying expectations that weren't mine. Tired of shrinking my dreams to make them more acceptable to people who would never fully accept them anyway. And in that exhaustion, something shifted. I stopped asking, what if they're right? And started asking, what if I am? That question changed everything. It didn't erase the fear. It didn't magically replace doubt with confidence. What it did was interrupt the pattern. For the first time, I considered the possibility that my parents' limitations were not prophecies, but reflections. Reflections of their own disappointments, their own unrealized dreams, their own fear of risk. Understanding this didn't make the pain disappear, but it untangled it from my identity. I began to separate their story from mine. That separation was subtle at first. It showed up in small decisions. I stopped explaining my goals in advance. I stopped seeking validation for plans I already knew I wanted. I allowed myself to feel excitement privately, without rehearsing how I'd defend it later. These weren't acts of rebellion. They were acts of preservation. Inner strength didn't arrive as confidence. It arrived as clarity. I realized I had spent years trying to be understood by people who weren't listening, trying to prove myself to an audience that had already made up its mind. That realization wasn't empowering at first. It was heartbreaking. Because it meant accepting that the approval I wanted might never come, that the support I needed might not exist in the form I imagined. Grief followed awareness. I grieved the parents I wished I had, the conversations that never happened, the encouragement that should have been natural but never was. I let myself feel that grief fully, without minimizing it, without justifying it away. For the first time, I stopped telling myself it wasn't that bad. I stopped comparing my pain to others. I acknowledged it as real. That acknowledgement felt like standing upright after years of bending. And something remarkable happened when I stopped denying my pain. It stopped controlling me. The emotional awakening wasn't loud, it was steady. It felt like choosing truth over comfort, again and again. I stopped pretending their words didn't hurt. I stopped pretending I didn't care. I let myself feel anger, not explosive, not destructive, but focused. Anger that clarified boundaries. Anger that said, this ends here. The decision to no longer be defined by what was imposed on me wasn't a single choice. It was a series of quiet refusals. I refused to let their doubt dictate my effort. I refused to let their fear define my future. I refused to let their laughter rewrite my worth. With each refusal, I felt a little stronger, not because the fear disappeared, but because I acted anyway. Inner strength, I learned, isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to move forward while carrying it. I started rewriting my internal dialogue. When the familiar voice whispered, "You're aiming too high," I asked, according to whom? When it said, "Don't get your hopes up," I replied, "Why not?" These weren't affirmations. They were challenges. And slowly, the voice lost its authority. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine success without immediately imagining humiliation afterward. I let myself picture acceptance letters without rehearsing how I'd downplay them. I let myself believe, not fully, not blindly, but enough to keep going honestly. This was the true rupture. I stopped preparing for failure before it happened. That shift affected everything. I studied differently, not harder, but with intention. I wrote applications with honesty instead of apology. I stopped framing my ambitions as unrealistic and started framing them as necessary. Necessary for my growth, necessary for my survival, necessary for the person I was becoming. There was a moment, sitting at my desk, when I realized I no longer needed my parents to understand me in order to move forward. That realization felt both liberating and sad. Liberating because it freed me from waiting. Sad because it meant letting go of a hope I'd carried quietly for years. But letting go made space. Space for self-trust, space for self-respect, space for a version of me that didn't need to be smaller to be loved. I didn't stop loving my parents, but I stopped letting their limitations shape my choices. I accepted that they might never cheer, that they might never see me the way I wanted to be seen, and instead of fighting that reality, I stepped around it. The inner strength I found wasn't loud or performative. It didn't announce itself. It showed up when I submitted applications without asking for opinions, when I imagined leaving without apologizing for it, when I allowed myself to believe that my life could expand beyond the walls I grew up in. The turning point wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about proving myself free, free to define success on my own terms, free to want more without guilt, free to step into a future that didn't require permission. That awareness didn't erase the past, but it changed my relationship to it. The wounds were still there, but they no longer dictated my direction. They became part of my story, not the authors of it. And for the first time, I understood something deeply. Inner strength isn't something you're born with. It's something you build the moment you decide your voice matters, especially when no one else believes it does. That decision marked the beginning of my becoming. Overcoming didn't feel like a finish line. It felt more like stepping into open air after living too long in a narrow hallway. There was no sudden joy, no cinematic relief. What I felt first was unfamiliar quiet, the kind that comes when the noise you've lived with for years finally fades. And in that quiet, I began to hear myself. The day I truly understood that I was free wasn't the day I left home, nor the day my plans finally worked out. It was the day I realized I no longer needed to explain my choices to survive them. I no longer rehearsed conversations that would never happen. I no longer imagined how my parents might react before deciding how I felt. Their voices, once constant, had softened into echoes, still present, but no longer commanding. Freedom, I learned, is not the absence of pain. It's the absence of permission. For a long time, I thought overcoming meant winning some invisible argument, proving them wrong, showing them that I had been capable all along. But the truth is quieter and far more powerful. Overcoming meant no longer needing their agreement for my life to move forward. It meant releasing the idea that validation had to come from the same place the wound did. There was grief in that realization. I won't pretend otherwise. Letting go of the hope that my parents would one day understand me felt like letting go of a childhood I never fully had. But grief, when faced honestly, does something surprising. It creates space. And in that space, something gentler grows: self-respect. I began to rebuild my relationship with myself, piece by piece. I stopped punishing myself for wanting more. I stopped questioning whether my dreams were too much. I stopped shrinking my story to make it easier for others to digest. I allowed myself to take up emotional space without apology. That didn't make life perfect. Some days the old doubts still showed up uninvited. Some days I still heard the familiar whisper, "Don't get ahead of yourself." But now I recognized it for what it was, a memory, not a command. And instead of obeying it, I acknowledged it, then kept going. Growth isn't dramatic, it's repetitive. It looks like choosing yourself again and again, especially on days when it feels uncomfortable. It looks like trusting your decisions, even when no one claps. It looks like walking forward with unanswered questions and unanswered messages and unanswered expectations, and deciding that's okay. Over time, I noticed changes that surprised me. I spoke with more certainty. I allowed myself to feel proud without immediately undercutting it. I stopped apologizing for things that didn't require forgiveness: my ambition, my boundaries, my distance. I learned that peace doesn't come from fixing the past, but from refusing to relive it. My relationship with my parents didn't magically heal. And that's an important truth. Overcoming doesn't always come with reconciliation. Sometimes it comes with clarity. Sometimes it comes with limits. Sometimes it comes with loving people from a distance that protects your growth. I stopped expecting them to become people they had never shown themselves capable of being. And in doing so, I released both them and myself from a role we had been stuck in for too long. I no longer needed them to change for me to move forward. That was liberation. I learned to define success on my own terms. Not as revenge, not as proof, but as alignment. Alignment between who I was becoming and how I was living. Alignment between my values and my actions. Alignment between my inner world and the life I was building. The most powerful outcome of overcoming wasn't confidence. It was trust. Trust in my instincts. Trust in my resilience. Trust that even if things fell apart, I could rebuild without losing myself. That trust became my foundation, steadier than any approval I had once chased. If there is one truth I carry forward, it's this: you do not owe your silence to people who taught you to doubt yourself. You do not owe your smallness to places that could not hold your growth. And you do not owe your future to your past. Healing doesn't require rewriting your history. It requires reclaiming authorship. I am not defined by the laughter that dismissed me. I am not defined by the doubt that surrounded me. I am defined by the choice I made, to listen inward when the world grew loud, to step forward when fear insisted I stay still, to believe myself worthy even when belief was withheld. To anyone reading this who feels unseen in their own home, unheard in the spaces meant to nurture them, your longing is not a flaw. It is information. It is telling you that there is more waiting for you and that you are allowed to reach for it. You don't need permission to grow. You don't need consensus to begin. You don't need applause to be right. Sometimes the bravest thing you will ever do is walk toward a life that makes sense to you, even if no one else understands it. Overcoming is not about erasing the pain. It's about refusing to let pain decide who you become. And that choice, quiet, steady, deeply personal, is where freedom truly begins.